Hi, I'm Trevor. I'm a sophomore finance student here at UK.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a freshman majoring in neuroscience and psychology.
Welcome to the Breaking the Boundary podcast presented by No Limits Productions. So, to give you a little bit of background about what we're trying to do here, No Limits Productions was founded to strive to educate, inform, and inspire our audiences to take their futures into their own hands by embracing truly entrepreneurial mindsets. No Limits Productions will take a multi-platform approach to illuminating entrepreneurship as a major key to solving economic inequity and social issues specifically affecting the Commonwealth and her surrounding regions. This podcast specifically is aimed at addressing pressing topics that we view as really important to improving our state and our country. A particular focus is going to be aimed at solutions because the value in speaking on problems comes when we come together, break boundaries, and find true solutions. With this in mind, let's introduce our first topic and get into some nice conversation. Our first topic is the opioid epidemic, and I'm going to kick it to Michael for some more information.
All right, thanks, Trevor. So opioids are a group of drugs that range from prescription drugs like codeine to illegal drugs like heroin. Prescription opioids are primarily used for pain relief, and they work by attaching to the opioid receptors in your brain and boosting your feelings of pleasure while blocking feelings of pain. If you live in the Midwest and eastern portion of the United States, you already know plenty about the destruction and despair that opioids have brought to many of the most vulnerable parts of society. Drug overdoses killed 70,000 Americans in 2017 alone, with the vast majority involving opioids. This public health emergency continues as an average of 130 people die every day from opioid-related overdoses. This is an issue that affects real lives every day. It's so important to keep this in mind, and when we see huge numbers like this, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers and not see that it's real people behind each and every one of those statistics. In 2018, Kentucky providers wrote 60% more opioid prescriptions compared to the average U.S. state. And in 2017, more than 1,500 of our fellow Kentuckians died from drug overdoses. This is an average of 4 lives lost each day. And the number of deaths is increasing at a rate of about 11.5% each year. Kentucky's drug overdose rate in 2017 was the 4th highest among all 50 states. And over the last few years, we've started to see the life expectancy in the United States decline very slowly due to deaths of despair, such as suicides and drug overdoses, as we'll talk about today. Kentucky has been in the midst of an opioid crisis for years now, and each year the issue proliferates itself more and more. This is what you'll see in Trevor's great conversation with our guest.
So, a little bit about our guest this week. His name's Dr. Alexander Elswick, and I really think that his personal journey with opioid addiction is going to be really inspiring for our audience. And also, coming out of his opioid addiction, Alexander Elswick has turned his life around in a really inspiring way. He has decided to co-found a nonprofit called Voices of Hope that works to help substance abuse disorder victims. And in addition to that, he serves as the assistant professor for substance use prevention and recovery here on campus. I really think you're going to enjoy this interview.
I'd like to welcome you on to the first ever episode of the Breaking the Boundary podcast. It's awesome to have a guest for our first episode. And Jacob, one of my friends, someone you've had in class, has told me a lot of good things, said you're very, very knowledgeable, and I'm really looking forward to getting to this material. So without further ado, hey everybody, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander Elswick. He's the assistant extension professor for substance use prevention and recovery, and he's also the co-founder of Voices of Hope, which is a nonprofit serving the Lexington community. It's focused on helping people struggling with substance abuse disorders. Dr. Elswick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing terrific. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So I'd like to start off maybe with a little bit of background about yourself, like what led you to your current position, maybe some life experiences you had, and what led you to really study what you study.
Yeah, so actually, I went to Center College for my undergrad, and when I was in my senior year at Center College, I was studying for the LSAT and getting ready to go to law school, and I thought that was my purpose. And at the same time, I was struggling with an addiction, and that ended up totally changing course and taking me to where I am. So I'm a person in long-term recovery from an addiction to Oxycontin and subsequently to heroin. And my addiction started with a prescription to opioids at 18 when I had elective oral surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed, and got a big dose of oxycodone and got addicted to it. And long story short, I spent 6 years in active addiction. I was homeless in 4 different cities. I went to jail on, felony drug trafficking charges, and slept under a bridge. And last day, I shot dope was September 13th of 2013. So it's been a long and crazy journey.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. We're honored to hear about your journey, and we recognize the struggles you've been through, and we really appreciate you coming on and talking with us today. But so what do you believe fundamentally has caused the opioid epidemic in the United States?
That's a good question, but boy, is it a big question. So there are a lot of different strands to touch on, and I'll try to be like as brief as I can. But to begin with, historically, we haven't known, addiction has been sort of like a redhead stepchild in terms of it hasn't had a disciplinary home. We haven't known, should psychologists be treating this? Should psychiatrists be treating it? Is this an issue for the church? Is it an issue for public health? And because nobody's known whose job it is to address it, it's easy, it often falls through the cracks. The buck doesn't stop anywhere with addiction. That's a problem. But beyond, and so that's a broad problem with drugs in general. But more specifically with the opioid epidemic, you had a couple of things. First of all, in 1995, the American Pain Society started advocating to have pain added as a 5th vital sign. And what that means is every time the nurse comes in or the doctor is making rounds at the hospital, they don't just check your blood pressure and your heart rate. Now they're also prioritizing pain. And what that meant was we started treating pain really aggressively. And so doctors in medical school were being encouraged to treat pain. Also in 1995, a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma released Oxycontin. And what made Oxycontin special was prior to its release, folks with chronic pain would have to take multiple pain pills all throughout the day, every 4 to 6 hours. And Oxycontin was an extended release tablet that would give you pain relief for 12 hours. So it was supposed to be a miracle drug. The problem was you had prescribers being encouraged to treat pain aggressively. You have this pill that's really so potent it should be used for cancer patients, and instead now it's being used to treat minor outpatient procedures and pain. And oh, by the way, if you snort the pill or shoot it, you can break through the extended time release and get all the high at once. So those things combined together. Also, Purdue Pharma really aggressively marketed Oxycontin as a non-addictive pain treatment. And they base that on this famous letter to the New England Journal of Medicine called Porter and Jick. So if you're interested, you can look it up. A professor and grad student, Herschel Jick and Jane Porter, wrote an article in 1983 as a very insignificant letter to the editor of the journal saying they hadn't seen in their review of hospital records very much opioid addiction. And based on that very small, not an academic peer-reviewed paper, but just a very small letter to an editor, that was like the cornerstone of Purdue saying these pills aren't addictive. And long story short, where that took us was the overprescribing of pain medication and an opioid epidemic.
Wow. It's crazy how something that small can lead to a problem that spans generations.
Yeah.
But so in preparation for this episode, Jacob and I did a lot of research regarding statistics about the opioid epidemic in Kentucky and the opioid epidemic in the United States as a whole. And we found that Kentucky is one of the worst hit states overall. Why do you think Kentucky's so uniquely impacted by this problem?
Yeah, Kentucky is, if you look at a heat map of overdose deaths, there's 2 hot spots, and one is in Appalachia and the other is in Southwest United States, like Oklahoma. And so, yeah, Kentucky's consistently hit hard. We lead the country in hepatitis C incidents. We lead the country in, I think, in women who are incarcerated. I believe we lead the country in children who are in foster care due to parents who are incarcerated. I mean, it really is awful. So a lot of it we could attribute to rural poverty that we see in Kentucky. I mean, rural poverty is really different than just living in a rural area. It's a very different experience. So folks in Eastern Kentucky who saw the departure of industry, the decline of coal, the loss of jobs, that led to an economic depression. You combine that with the fact that Purdue deliberately marketed Oxycontin in those regions because they identified, coal miners who had chronic pain or a lot of people who were on disability, and therefore their insurance would pay for Oxycontin. I mean, so it's really kind of dark in that sense and insidious, but yeah, Kentucky is consistently, and also the biggest one, we're in the top 5 states in overdose mortality year after year.
Goodness. So other than like the damage to personal health, what can be some of the problems or the issues that are associated with an area that has such a high incidence of opioid addiction?
Yeah, the downstream effects of addiction are vast, and I think it's almost impossible to calculate the total cost when you think about the loss of productivity because of the people who leave the workforce because they're addicted and can't pass a drug test. When you think about the kids who are either experiencing neglect in a legal sense, that something that actually rises to the legal definition of neglect, but also I think there are a lot of addicted parents who are doing their best to care for their kids so that what they're doing doesn't rise to the threshold of legal neglect, but they are negatively impacting the attachment that they form with their children. I certainly think those effects are important to recognize. And then, we talk a lot about statistics on overdose deaths, but I think it's helpful to remember that for every individual who overdoses and passes away, there's an entire family system surrounding that person who's impacted. And it's an incredible amount of grief and tragedy for that entire system, that entire community. So yeah, the downstream effects, the kids in foster care, the cases of Hep C, HIV, endocarditis, the strain on the healthcare system. And then above all of that, I think the nail in the coffin is we continue to choose to address addiction as a criminal justice issue. And that just consistently exacerbates the problem.
Yeah. Kind of in that same vein, like I said earlier, in the process of preparing for this episode, we did a ton of research, and almost every statistic that I found shocked me. It's like, and I think part of the shocking part is that you don't hear about it that often. It's a massive problem and it's completely underaddressed. Why do you think such a problem that has such an impact on our state and in our country is underaddressed?
I think that has mostly to do with stigma, with the perception that people who get addicted it's your own fault. You got addicted because of your own bad decision making, which is a narrative that people still subscribe to in the United States. And what that leads to is people feeling like if you got yourself in, it's your job to get yourself out. Why should I be using my tax dollars or my time and energy to try to support you? And there are plenty of arguments to explain why we should all be invested in that, because the downstream effects of recovery similarly are as vast as the downstream effects of addiction. So if the entire community was as invested in seeing people recover, we all benefit. Businesses benefit, the tax base benefits, across the board.
Yeah. And whenever you said earlier, you said that a lot of different parties had basically passed the buck on the issue, and the buck never stopped. Like the problem was never fully addressed because everyone insisted that it was somebody else's problem. But something that I really admire about you and your journey is that you founded an organization that's based on helping people struggling with substance abuse. I'd love for you to talk more about Voices of Hope.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. The shameless plug for Voices. So we're a recovery community organization, and it's important to distinguish that from a treatment organization because they're distinct and we really do two different things. And it's helpful to have a little background to understand why we do what we do. So first of all, our treatment apparatus is set up to treat people either 30 days at a time or maybe 90 days. The longest term treatment centers generally are 6 months, and that's fine. The problem is addiction is a chronic disorder. And so it causes these changes in the brain that last up to 5 years. So if you have these changes that are going to impact decision making and compromise your brain for 5 years, but we're only treating you for 30 days, obviously that's inadequate. And from day 31 to year 5, you need support and disease management. And so that would be where a recovery community organization steps in, because we're the community hub for recovery, so that folks aren't having to leave their community to go to treatment to access all the supports they need. They have it in the community. Also, one more statistic that's helpful to understand what we do, and this may be surprising to you. It was surprising to me the first time I kind of wrapped my head around it. The majority of people who are in recovery today got in recovery without any formal help whatsoever.
Wow.
That means no treatment, inpatient or outpatient. That means no therapy, and it even means no mutual aid or 12-step meetings. We call it natural recovery. And that surprises most people, because we typically tell a story about addiction that people need to hit rock bottom and then they need to go to treatment, and that's the only way people get better. And it's not true. That's actually the exception and not the rule. So if most people are recovering outside of a treatment context, then it makes sense that we need to build in community supports to support them outside of a treatment context. So long explanation short, that's what we do. We're the hub for recovery resources in the community. We host dozens of different kinds of meetings to meet the needs for all different pathways of recovery, people on medication, people who use a harm reduction pathway, et cetera, et cetera. We have a telephone program to connect people in recovery. We have recovery coaching to help build those resources for folks. It's really, really a cool program.
That's incredible. That's incredible. It sounds super, super innovative. Obviously I'm not as well versed on the issue as you, but are there other areas doing the same thing, or is this?
Yeah, I wish we could just take credit for it, because it was really cool. It was really fitting for me personally, because I was in graduate school at the time, and all of my research focuses on this concept called recovery capital. And without going down a rabbit hole, in short, it just refers to those community-based resources. Mm-hmm. Those, basically what we do at Voices of Hope is build those recovery capital, those resources. So as I was learning about that idea and that concept, we went to the Northeast, to Rhode Island and Connecticut, where there were two of the original recovery community organizations in the country. And as soon as I stepped foot inside that place, we went to a place called CCAR in Connecticut. And as soon as we walked in, the person at the front desk said, "How can I help you with your recovery today?" Which just struck me as the coolest thing that anybody could say. And then we stepped into a room where there was a group of about 10 or 12 folks who were doing a life skills program on employability. And I thought, man, this is what we need. And so we came back to Lexington and tried to, in some senses, replicate it, and in some senses kind of make it our own.
That's awesome. That sounds like see, that's what this podcast is all about. I'm not sure whenever Jacob emailed you, what he told you about No Limits Productions, but we were basically founded with the mindset that there are things that slip through the cracks. There are things that people pass the buck on, but at some point the buck has to stop.
Yep.
And we as an organization are committed to like shining the light on things like Voices of Hope that are going out with an entrepreneurial mindset and solving problems on their own, because whenever people are passing the buck, somebody's got to stop it. But on the further about Voices of Hope, on your guys' website, which is awesome, by the way, it's super, super easy to use, super easy to navigate. I saw that it had said that reducing stigma can contribute to combating the problem. Like, what are some of the stigmas that surround substance abuse disorders, and how do we work to reduce them?
Yeah, there's the biggest stigma is just the notion that if you're a person who uses drugs or a person who's addicted, that there's something bad about you, wrong about you, delinquent about you, deviant about you. And none of that's true. What we know now from the evidence about neurodiversity and about the brain is we all have different brains and we all experience drugs in different ways. So I think that's really where the stigma begins. And then it leads to this story that, for instance, once you're addicted, you can never use substances safely again, which is this story that we tell over and over and over again. My first sponsor in a 12-step program used to tell me the toothpaste is out of the tube. In other words, like, have you ever accidentally squeezed too much toothpaste out of the tube? You can't put it back in once it's out. You just got to use it, you know? And so he would say, with respect to your drug use, you've pushed too much toothpaste out of the tube, you've crossed the line, and you can never return to safely using or moderately using drugs. And that's not true. The evidence doesn't show that. The evidence shows 4 out of 5 people who drink in recovery, so after resolving a significant drug addiction, won't develop an alcohol problem. You know, I mean, that's not consistent with the story we tell, but it's the stigma that lives, that kind of enshrouds it, that keeps people from wanting to employ people who are addicted, from wanting to be a part of the solution.
Yeah. How can we ensure that the people who are suffering know how to and are willing to seek help?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize, first of all, that if the only tool that you have in your tool belt is treatment, if every time somebody comes to you with a drug-related problem and your only solution is to ship them out of their community, for them to leave their job, leave their children, and leave their home, we have to recognize that comes at a huge cost. And nobody ever talks about that. Everybody just assumes if you're addicted, you'll be ready and willing to just give up 6 months of your life. And that's not the way that it works. And so that's a tremendous barrier to have that expectation that, I mean, we don't expect anyone with any other disorder to do something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think what's important in order to meet the needs and let people know the help that's available is to bring it to people in their community. And so in some ways, that's what Voices of Hope is all about. And in fact, we just got a grant for a couple of mobile units that are going to go into underserved communities and try to bring harm reduction services to people who are in early stages of recovery or, you know, actively using drugs. And it's a way of saying we can't continue to sit back and wait on people to come to us for treatment. Yeah. We got to go to people and provide the services.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's awesome. So you said you guys got a grant to go to underserved communities. Are you guys going to focus on the Kentucky region, or are you going to go beyond Kentucky?
Yeah, we have been really very fortunate when it comes to grant funding over the last, really since our inception. We expanded from 1 employee to 20 something employees based on grant funding really quickly. And that has allowed us, so for instance, we're a part of the Healing Communities study at UK, which is a huge $90 million study of opioid overdose. And through that grant, we're serving 16 counties in central Kentucky. And our programming has taken us almost across the state.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really awesome. So whenever we're talking about the opioid epidemic, nationwide, statewide, community-wide, where do you think it's going to require synergy between government and the private sector and nonprofits to fully solve the issue?
Yeah, synergy is a great word. And I think to some extent, the government's got to get out of our way. I mean, I think part of the problem is the justice system. That's a huge issue, that we continue to send people with substance use disorders, which we have acknowledged as a disorder, as a clinical disorder, and yet we continue to address it in the court system. And that's a problem. And even things like drug courts, which we think of as progressive alternatives to incarceration, can actually be even more problematic. People can end up stuck in the system, stuck in drug court for longer than if they just served their sentence. And there are a lot of problems with that. So I think synergy is a good word. I think we need to explore decriminalizing drugs at the least, maybe legalizing and regulating. And then I think more money needs to be given to community-based psychosocial supports. It's constantly, I'll give you a cool stat. There are about 25 million people in recovery in the United States today. And there are about that many people who are addicted. And in 2016, according to like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 90% of people who needed treatment didn't receive it, okay? And that's a huge stat, and we call that the treatment gap, and people clamor about that and say, we need more treatment beds. Obviously, we need money for more treatment centers because we must not have enough treatment available. But here's the interesting thing. If you do a deeper dive on that data and you ask those folks who didn't receive treatment, why they didn't receive treatment, like 90% of them will say, because I don't think I need treatment. That's a big problem. That's a huge, and like 38% of them will say, I didn't get treatment because I don't even want to be abstinent. And so those are huge, huge issues if our whole treatment apparatus is based on that, right? And so the reality is what we need more of is treatment approaches that meet people where they are. That's not as intensive as having to leave your community, and really gives people the opportunity to flourish.
So something that we continuously came across was like the mention of like a vicious cycle, where it's like overprescription, overuse, and undertreatment.
Mhm.
What do you think the key is to breaking that cycle?
Yeah, I think the biggest cycle is, I experienced it myself. The biggest cycle in addiction is going in and out of treatment centers. And I met guys that went to 15 and 20 inpatient treatment centers. I met families who dipped into their 401k and took out a second mortgage on their home to put a kid through at their 12th treatment center. And I experienced it myself. I went through a half a dozen treatment centers, and I did fine in treatment. When I was in a structured environment with peer support and counseling, I did well and I was getting better. The problem was they're releasing me from treatment after 30 days and I've got a 5-year problem.
Yeah.
So that's what the cycle leads to. Some of the data right now suggest people with opioid use disorder require 7 cycles of treatment and relapse. And I think if we were talking about alcohol use disorder, that might be acceptable. But with opioids, in the context of an overdose epidemic, we can't be confident that our loved ones are going to survive 7 cycles of treatment, right? Many of them are going to pass away and not make it. So again, I would just put the emphasis on treatment can't be the only place we address addiction. We have to be addressing it into the communities by increasing employment opportunities, by accepting people, whatever that looks like, accepting them in educational settings, accepting them in office settings, accepting them in healthcare settings. That's the answer.
So this has really, really been awesome. This interview has been great, but I got one final question for you, and it really ties back to the purpose of the pod.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we as college students do to help combat this growing problem?
What you can do first is not be a part of the problem. So, right, before we even do the lofty work of like solving it, let's make sure we're not continuing to perpetuate the problem. And one way that people unintentionally, just totally inadvertently without realizing it, perpetuate the problem is they perpetuate the story of addiction. I call it the single story of addiction, but it's that idea that everyone who gets addicted must be, using drugs chaotically. They need to hit rock bottom. We need to not enable them or support them until they decide they're willing to go to, we got to stop that. And we got to recognize that substance use and substance use addiction are so incredibly complex. They are so incredibly complicated that we can't reduce it down to this distilled single story. There's great heterogeneity in experiences with drugs. And so I think something that's really helpful for college students to do is when you hear somebody make that really lazy one-off remark about addiction, is maybe to challenge it and say, is that true? Or is it true that that addiction looks a lot different for a lot of different people?
Yeah. It's like you can't provide a blanket solution, just like you can't have a blanket definition of what addiction looks like.
Right.
Because Dr. Elswick, it's super impressive that you've recovered, and now you're doctor, you're the assistant statistics professor. It's honestly great. It's great to talk to you. We really appreciate you coming on today, and we can't wait to get this episode published, and I'll send it straight to you once we get it published. I'm looking forward to it. But
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on today, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me, for the opportunity to kind of have a platform to share some of this, and I'm honored to be number one, the first.
Yeah, number one. You'll always be number one.
That's
get
awesome.
T-shirts printed off. We'll have to get one to you.
That's great. Thank you for having me, man. It's awesome.
Right. Thank you.
See you.
See ya.
So, as Dr. Elswick and I discussed, there's really a serious issue facing our Commonwealth that needs a serious solution. The only way to come to that solution is via action. The only route to action is adopting an entrepreneurial mindset and talking about the details of the issue truly in depth. and researching and coming to possible solutions that can help to end the vicious cycle of overprescription, overuse, and undertreatment when it comes to opiates. We need to stop providing excuses and passing blame, as Dr. Elswick and I talked about. It's time to make a change. If you want to be part of this change in the Lexington community, I really encourage you to check out Voices of Hope Lexington. They have a really nice interactive website, and it'd be a great opportunity for you to get involved in the true solution to this problem.
Yep. Dr. Elswick's conversation was extremely inspiring and inspirational. It's always super enjoyable to hear from people who are passionate about their work in our area and are employing an entrepreneurial mindset to tackle the issues most important to them. As Trevor and our guest discussed, we still have a long way to go in combating this issue. Kentucky lags in a number of important areas of providing substance abuse treatment. Kentucky falls below the national average in the number of behavioral health professionals compared to the number of patients present. A 2013 report on Kentucky's healthcare workforce estimated Kentucky needs about 1,600 additional full-time mental health providers, which includes social workers and social counselors. A 2017 analysis by the Council on State Governments calculated the state general funding spending on substance abuse agencies and found that Kentucky was the worst state in the country by this measure, which basically measures the effectiveness of the dollars that Kentucky puts towards substance abuse treatment. At this point, it's easier for us to see the opioid issue for what it is, but that doesn't mean we can solve this problem just overnight. This epidemic has become deeply systemic, and the response and treatment efforts have not been improved enough for the challenges of a contemporary world. The number of offenders imprisoned for drug trafficking grew from 1,500 in 2012 to about 1,900 in 2016. This, as you'll note, is about a 25% increase, while at the same time, the number of offenders being jailed for drug possession increased from just 900 in 2012 to 1,800 in 2016, which is a 105% increase. While we can't solve the issue of the opioid epidemic with a snap of our fingers, there's still work we can do to reverse the systems that have incarcerated the victims of this problem. We can strive to gain support for ideas such as reclassifying drug possession as a misdemeanor in order to reduce the number of felons that are jailed for this offense. We can increase state support for substance abuse treatment. We can also continue efforts to make medication that can reverse opioid addiction more widely available. And we can continue the use of mandatory prescription programs, encourage the creation of needle exchange programs, and create local collaboratives with community and business leaders to solve this issue.
See, all these potential solutions that Michael discussed, I mean, these are things that we need to be focusing on as young people in the world. The opioid epidemic, it's an issue, it affects thousands of our fellow Kentuckians, and as Michael said, millions of Americans across the country. We as a state and country, we have to come together and help end the stigma surrounding opioid addiction. We need to support local community-based nonprofits like Dr. Elswick's Voices of Hope, and we have to make sure that we support those in our lives who may be struggling. This problem, like many others, it's not going to go away on its own. And in the same way, government or business or the private sector, nonprofits, they can't wave a wand and make this problem dissipate with some simple solution. We as a public, we have to strive to take part of the responsibility for solving societal problems into our own hands. And the opioid epidemic is a great place to start. We need to accept that addiction is a complex problem and that substance use is an actual clinical disorder. We need to challenge the narrative that addiction is the result of laziness, carelessness, or any other negative adjective that you might want to use. We need to support those in our communities who are struggling, whether that be through accepting them, offering them a helping hand, donating our time to places like Voices of Hope. Ultimately, we all have a role to play, and the clock is ticking too fast to let time slip away. Thank you. We really appreciate you guys tuning into the first episode of Breaking the Boundary, sponsored by No Limits Productions. From Michael and I, we hope that you have a really safe and healthy week. We look forward to speaking with you again next week. And in the meantime, stay courageous, stay curious, and stay committed to creating the positive change that you guys want to see in your communities.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.